Chapter 626, Temple of the Dying Light, 1. It's not dead yet. Just temporarily affected by the curse. Lazarus stared at the monster in front of him with heavy caution. It was for that reason that he dove back down. The moment he touched the seedbed and found the creature through the thread that remained connected to it, he didn't waste a single second and placed his hand over its body. Several threads shot out from his hand, trying to pierce through its tough outer skin, but he was surprised to see his threads unable to dig into its body. This is a little bit troublesome. Lazarus looked at the monster and decided to apply even more curses to it, wrapping its entire body with them. He could see the creature starting to lose even more strength as he did so, and it wasn't long before it simply lay on the seabed, unmoving. Lazarus stared at the body of the creature before settling his gaze on its antenna. He moved towards it and nudged his head towards it as he did, he made a slicing motion with his hand. What? You want me to cut it? And as quickly understood Lazarus's meaning but was left at a loss. He didn't really understand why he wanted him to cut the antenna, but he still chose to comply and moved towards it before taking out a pair of daggers and slicing down. His movement was quick and the antenna was sliced off cleanly. The darkness embraced them shortly after. Silence. Inez stood in silence, staring in the direction of where Lazarus had been moments prior, waiting for him to do something. And soon. Flick. A pale light flickered into life. Inez's eye widened when he saw this. Holding on to the end of the antenna, Lazarus calmly raised it and illuminated their surroundings. It works. He felt proud as he looked at the lamp in his hand. Inez also looked extremely surprised as he looked at the lamp, seemingly trying to ask how he had done this. The answer was really simple. All he had to do was channel mana into the bottom part of the lamp and the light would turn on. The mechanism was simple, and most importantly, looking around, Lazarus felt that any creature that would see the light would immediately distance itself from them. He felt that only this light would work and any other initiation would only bring the opposite effect. He now felt a little bit safer. That is, of course, unless it's a destroyer-ranked monster that preys on this monster. Lazarus could only hope he wouldn't meet such a creature. If he really did, then the only thing he could do was hope he would survive. With the lamp casting a dim light over the surroundings, Lazarus nudged Inez and walked forward. At the same time, he activated Lament of Lies, and the image of the monster from before started to take over the two of them. Now, we should be indistinguishable from that thing. With the light illuminating a small radius around them, Inez and Lazarus walked forward, the darkness no longer a concern. There was still the issue of the silence, but the two quickly adjusted to it. It should be somewhere here. Lazarus strained to remember where he'd seen the strange structure before. As he pressed on, a long, sharp silhouette outline emerged on the horizon. His brows immediately shot up at the sight as he looked at Inez, who also looked at the distant structure with curiosity. He hurried his movements, his legs moving as though he were on the surface. This was all thanks to step of suppression that enabled him and Inez to move without much effort under the water. It kept them grounded to the seabed, preventing them from floating up. Eventually arriving before the structure, Lazarus stopped. His eyes locked onto a massive obelisk rising out of the seafloor like a blackened fang. Strange symbols were carved deep into the stone, but most of them were hidden beneath long strands of red seaweed that clung to its surface like veins. The markings pulsed faintly under the pale glow of his lamp, but he couldn't tell if it was just the movement of the water or something else. But that wasn't what made him freeze. He lifted the lamp a little higher. The beam pushed against the murk, and far in the distance, shadows took shape. Buildings? Dozens of them. They were huge and twisted, made of dark stone that had eroded and degraded over time. Red spiky coral had grown over most of their surfaces in thick layers, wrapping around them in a way that almost made it seem like it was strangling them. Some of the structures looked like broken temples or drowned cathedrals, their towers snapped in half or bent at sharp, unnatural angles. In front of several buildings stood statues. There were too many to count. Most were missing limbs or heads. The ones that remained intact were worse. Their faces were nearly erased by centuries underwater, but the outlines that were left, they weren't calm. They were distorted. Mouths open too wide. Eyes hollow and deep. It looked like they had been caught mid-scream, and whatever they had seen, it had been enough to break them. Lazarus didn't move for a long time. Something about this place felt wrong. And it wasn't just the silence. Focus. Focus. I need to figure out where the guy went. He must be here somewhere. Lazarus tried his best to maintain calm as he scanned the place, his eyes glancing at the collapsed buildings and statues around. He was sure that the silhouette he had been chasing before was somewhere here. He just needed to find him. But where exactly could he start? Lazarus closed his eyes and looked around. He couldn't afford to waste time. He still had about 15 minutes of breath inside of him. He had to quickly find out the hiding spot of the strange group responsible for this entire situation and understand what they were planning. This was something that he had to do. If a red tide occurred, then he'd have no way to traverse the Red Sea and get to the remnant south, which had been his goal the entire time. This situation was not something that he could allow to occur. As such, he continued to move deeper into the city. But just as he took another step, his head flicked up rapidly as he sensed something rapidly approaching from above. His entire body tensed when he felt the presence above, but by the time he realized it was too late. Thump. A muffled noise echoed right after as two silhouettes appeared in the distance. The moment they caught sight of the figures, Lazarus and Inez both widened their eyes as they recognized one of them immediately. Silas, the captain of the Crimson Wraiths. Besides him was an unfamiliar figure. With long brown curly hair and green eyes, she wore a deep red coat lined with gold trim, the fabric worn at the edges. A wide leather belt crossed her waist, holding a long and narrow sword. Inez paled the moment he saw her, like the blood had been sucked clean from his veins. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His trembling fingers reached for Lazarus, but they stopped mid-motion. It was too late. By the time he tried to warn Lazarus, the two figures had already spotted them, their eyes locking onto the two of them, causing Inez to freeze on the spot. Oh shit. Awk. A loud gagging sound echoed within the confines of a small chamber, a figure with long hair stumbling forward as they clung to the well-polished marble floor beneath. Their fingers scraped across the cold stone, blood flowing out from the tips of their fingers. Yerk. Gagging once more, the figure raised his head to slowly reveal an extremely pale face, dark veins flowing out of their skin and webbing across their entire face. Stop. Make it stop. Jackal's breath was rough as he looked up. His head throbbed massively and he could hardly think. All he felt was pain. An endless amount of pain that invaded every part of his brain. How is this possible? He had known from the start that the assimilation with the blood was going to hurt, but to this extent? He couldn't understand at all. It was almost as if the blood itself was rejecting him, trying its best to shoot away from his body. Why are you rejecting me? It made no sense at all. This was his blood. Blood that should have belonged to him. How could it possibly be rejecting him? Something was amiss. No, I just need to try harder. I just underestimated the amount of time it takes for the blood to assimilate. Jackal gagged once more, forcing his body up and leaning against a tall marble pillar. He took several deep breaths as his head leaned to the side, saliva dripping down from the side of his mouth. To talk. It was also in that moment that he heard a loud knock coming from the distance. Jackal's eyes flickered and his entire demeanor shifted. His face turned rosy again and the veins receded. Standing up as though nothing was wrong, he moved towards the door where a familiar figure appeared. Cardinal. Jackal gave a short greeting to the concerned-looking cardinal. How are you doing? I'm doing fine. There's no issue with the assimilation. It shouldn't be long before I fully absorb the blood. That's a relief. Cardinal Ambrose covered his chest upon hearing the news. He was just about to say something else when Jackal spoke. I'm going back to the room. Unless there's something important, do not contact me. Clank. The door closed shortly after, leaving the cardinal unable to utter any more words. The cardinal could only stare at the door blankly before shaking his head. What a pity. His eyes flickered faintly, his muscles starting to spasm as he quickly massaged his face shortly after. This job is really hard. Chapter 627, Temple of the Dying Light, 2. What are they doing here? Lazarus's eyes narrowed at the sight of the two people ahead. Lament of Lies was still active, and as such, the two people up ahead were still unaware that what they were seeing was fake. Yet, Lazarus could keenly tell that the two people in front of him were strong enough to see through the illusion if they tried hard enough. It was for that reason that he focused entirely on making the illusion as believable as possible, slowly making the head of the monster turn away from them as a sign of disinterest. I hope this works. He wanted to interact with them, but at the same time he understood that there was a very good chance that they wouldn't be on his side. He had to tread carefully. The two people before him were too strong for him to take any risks. Thankfully, it looked like the two of them bought his illusion and slowly turned their heads away from them. It could be because the light he was holding was real or because they had other things they were more worried about, but the two swiftly moved away shortly after. It was only then that Lazarus felt his body relax. That was closer than expected. He was already aware that Silas was strong. Even so, he wasn't scared of him. Lazarus might not be able to beat him, but he had ways to take him on and run away. The issue lay with the woman. Lazarus was wholly unaware of who she was. No, actually, I might have an idea. It didn't take a genius to figure out her identity. One of the Seven Lords, and Esmeralda Eyes O'Malley. He judged this to be her when taking into account her eye color. There were only two female captains within the Seven Lords category. It was her and Madame Zhang Shi. Taking in the description for the madam who was described to have long and lustrous black hair, it was rather easy to determine the identity of the one before him. But that begged the question. Why is she here? And with the captain of the Crimson Wraiths? As far as Lazarus knew, the relationship between the Seven Lords wasn't exactly the greatest. They were all at odds with each other to gain ground within the Crimson Sea. There was only so much water they could cover that wasn't within the great primordial one's range. The more water they covered, the richer they became. This was why their relationship wasn't great. It also made the situation look all the more suspicious. Could they be involved in this matter? Could they be the ones responsible for the red tide? Feeling a certain tug and seeing Inaz's expression, Lazarus could see he also seemed to think that way. But Lazarus shook his head. It was still too early to tell. They could also be here just like them, trying to investigate the situation. It wouldn't be strange for others to notice the same abnormality as they did. But was this really the reason why they were here? Lazarus closed his eyes and looked away. He didn't move just yet. He activated Mana Sense and stared at their distant silhouettes. It was only once they were far away that he stopped channeling his mana into the lamp, allowing for the darkness to swallow them. At the same time, he tugged in Anaz's direction, telling him to move. Anaz followed obediently as Lazarus alleviated the gravity around them, and they started to move up, slowly moving in the direction of where the two lords had gone. The silence around them felt defeating, while the darkness felt isolating. Swimming within the cold waters with no light in sight, Lazarus felt completely alone. And that was in spite of knowing that Anaz was right behind him. Something about the waters felt extremely eerie. In order to distract himself from such thoughts, he maintained his focus on the two figures in the distance. Everything was proceeding smoothly, but that wasn't for long. Flick! As if a light switch had been flipped, a pale red glow suddenly flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows as the city slowly started to come to life. Lazarus immediately stopped the moment he noticed the changes, his entire body growing tense as Anaz similarly stopped. The two stood in shock as the corals and seaweed began to pulse with an eerie, lifelike rhythm. Tendrils slithered outward, growing longer, thicker, and coiling like serpents around the ruined buildings. With each pulse, the grip tightened, stone groaning under the pressure. Cracks spiderwebbed across the structures, and from deep within, a faint red glow began to throb. It was as if the broken and forgotten city had suddenly pulsed with life. But as if that wasn't enough, the statues lying dormant on the seabed began to stir, eyes flickering to life, bodies creaking as they started to move. Lazarus looked at the scene in surprise, the lamp in his hand flickering faintly. Then, slowly but surely, the statues turned their heads in their direction, eyes wide and mouths open, stuck in their mid-scream position. 1, 2, 3. He soon began to lose count. But by that point, it no longer mattered. Adding an extra one to a large number didn't make things worse since the situation was already really bad. Lazarus closed his eyes before opening them again. That's not good. At the same time, not far away. Two figures zoomed through the water, their movements smooth and almost effortless. In spite of the darkness that was now slowly being replaced by a faint red light, the two of them were able to see without a problem. Not only that, they were also able to breathe and talk smoothly underwater. This was the most basic of skills for two of the 7 lords of the Crimson Sea. Her. How do you think they'll fare? I don't know, nor do I care. Anne replied, looking completely disinterested. She had one goal in coming down to the depths of the water, and that was to figure out the ones responsible for stirring the great primordial one and causing a red tide. She couldn't care less about the people above, but it was in her best interest for her to figure out the source of the problem and quickly quell it. It was for this reason that she teamed up with Silas. You're as cold as ever, but fair enough. I wanted to do something for them, but there's no point. The city will take care of them. Anne raised her brow but didn't reply. It wasn't hard for her to see through the illusion skill used by the two people from before. Perhaps she would have struggled on land, but beneath the water where her eyes could see through everything, the illusion was child's play. She also judged them to be investigators from the temple of the goddess of light. It wasn't within her interest to dispose of them. And even if she did want to get rid of them, the city would do that for her. Like clockwork, the city stirred to life every 12 hours. With eerie timing, seaweed, coral, and strange sea creatures would rise from the depths of the city, slithering through the ruins with one purpose: consumption. Anything in their path, from scattered stones to living flesh, was devoured without hesitation, their bodies slowly calcifying, turning everything into stone. The statues beneath were the remains of the people who weren't able to escape from the dread that lived within the submerged city that was once part of Virathanash, but had been swallowed by a red tide thousands of years ago. Where did you say you felt the presence? Coming to a stop, Anna scanned her surroundings, her gaze sweeping past the numerous broken buildings. Looking down, she saw the statues slowly turn their heads in her direction, their hollow eyes and open mouths fixed on her. Her face remained unmoved at the sight of her as she flicked her finger in the water, a long trail following shortly after as the head of the statue exploded. Silas noticed her actions and raised his brow. He soon shook his head while chuckling. And here I thought I was the hot-tempered one. Shut up. Ha ha. Silas let out a sharp, mirthless laugh that rang through the gloom, the sound oddly out of place in the suffocating silence. His eyes swept the ruined landscape with a strange calm until they settled on a certain landscape. Ah, there it is. Towering in the distance was a colossal pyramid, forged from black stone that seemed to drink in the light. Coral had infested its surface, growing in sharp, unnatural spires that jutted upward like the teeth of some ancient beast. Their razor tips glinted faintly, pulsing with a dull red glow almost like a heartbeat. The corners of Silas's eyes curled at the sight of the gigantic pyramid in the distance as he nudged his head in Anne's direction. Do you see it? I do now. Anne pushed her body forward and moved towards the gigantic structure in the distance, her expression extremely serious. Eventually coming to a stop before the structure, she looked up, her face slightly tense. Despite her strength, the place gave her an unsettling feeling. This structure. It used to be the main temple that hosted the goddess of light. In the aftermath of the red tide that engulfed half the city, the temple was gradually forgotten, its once sacred halls left to decay in silence. Over time, it came to be known as the Temple of the Dying Light, a somber title that mirrored the severed link between the sanctuary and the goddess it once revered. You say it's here? Yes. Silas replied, his gaze falling onto the entrance of the structure. Even with his eyes, he could hardly see more than a couple of meters ahead, the darkness within the temple swallowing everything that entered. Okay. And nodded, taking a step forward and entering the temple. As she entered, the water around her chilled and her expression turned even more serious. Within moments, the darkness enveloped her, swallowing every inch of her being until there was nothing left but shadows. Silas traced her back with his eyes before eventually following from behind. As he did, he smiled ambiguously, his gaze looking back. The darkness eventually swallowed him too. Chapter 628, Temple of the Dying Light, 3. The world pulsed with a tinge of red. It pulsed in a rhythmic manner like a slow-beating heart. Bright. Dim. Bright. Dim. Within the pulsating city, Lazarus's gaze was fixed on the numerous statues staring in his direction. He could sense that the situation wasn't good, but he didn't run away. There was no point in running away. He could only calmly gauge the strength of the statues around him. The majority don't seem very strong, but I can feel the presence of several powerful ones. He just couldn't tell where they were. And that made things complicated. He was worried that they might ambush them at any given moment. Should I just back up to the surface? This was an option. The only issue was that he didn't know how fast the statues were. Could they catch up to him or not? Lazarus was lost in his own thoughts, but it wasn't for long. He couldn't afford to be lost in thoughts as the situation below him grew more and more tense. He was just about to make a decision when he felt a tug coming from Inaz. Lazarus turned his head to see Inaz staring in a specific direction. Lazarus followed Inaz's line of sight and his brow rose. Corals? Why is he staring at the corals? Did he perhaps figure something out? Lazarus's eyes glinted with keen interest. He didn't really want to abort the current situation. While he could always go back down, every second mattered. He couldn't afford to be wasting time going up and down. Lazarus's face quickly changed as he felt something behind him. He didn't even look before increasing the intensity of step of suppression. Whatever was coming at him quickly slowed down shortly after as Lazarus turned his head to see a statue moving in the water, its movement slowed and its arms stretched towards him. Almost as though it was trying to rip his throat. But that wasn't all. Right after the first statue moved, another one came, shooting at him like a bullet. Lazarus didn't hold back. Flicking his finger, a thread shot down towards the statue, coiling around its neck. Lazarus clenched his hand as the thread closed in and severed the statue's head. That should a. Lazarus's heart sank when he saw the headless statue continue to move. Thankfully, its movements had slowed down considerably. But the problem was that it wasn't dead. Could these things even be killed? The situation looked worse and worse when he looked around and saw that more and more statues were starting to move in their direction. Should I just go back up? At this rate? Lazarus's thoughts were broken by Inaz, who suddenly moved towards the decapitated statue. Wait, what is he doing? Right as Lazarus looked at him, Inaz turned around and motioned something with his hands, pointing around him. Lazarus cocked his head in confusion, but soon understood. He wants me to protect him? This realization further heightened his confusion, but he didn't think twice. He trusted Inaz's judgment, and as such, he increased the output of step of suppression to the maximum while his eyes started to slowly close. He had been holding back because he was afraid his actions might attract the attention of extremely powerful predators, but there was no point in holding back now. If Inaz figured something out, then it's worth a shot. Opening his eyes again, the world around them turned dark again. Inaz's steps paused, his gaze looking up as his expression nearly fell from shock as he saw the formation of a domain. However, quickly recalling his situation, he moved towards the headless statue. That was also when the domain closed in, swallowing everything within it as hands began to emerge in all directions. They clung to any of the statues that were within the domain, changing colors as red orbs appeared everywhere. Bang! 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 The world stirred, the domain shaking as Lazarus felt the statues outside trying to peer into the domain. He tried his best to ignore those statues while taking care of the ones inside as the hands grabbed the statues before smashing them against each other. Bang! Fragments of the statues shattered and tumbled throughout the domain as the hands repeated the process. None of the statues were able to put up much of a fight against the hands that numbered in the hundreds, but the situation was not as good as it seemed. Standing still, Lazarus could feel more and more statues cling to his outer domain. Riot. Like cockroaches, they latched onto the domain and started to tear through the very fabric of it. Lazarus tried his best to pay them no mind, but the more they latched on, the more difficult it became for him to keep the domain standing. It's still manageable. It's still. Thump. The ground quaked all of a sudden. Lazarus's brow shot up as he looked towards the distance, a certain dread creeping up through every part of his body as he heard another loud thump. It appeared to be coming from a distance, slowly approaching his domain. His heart squeezed when he felt the pressure coming from the distant creature or monster. He couldn't quite tell, and his gaze hastily directed itself towards Inaz, who was busy studying the headless statue. He wanted to tell him to hurry up, but he was too immersed in analyzing the statue. Lazarus clenched his teeth and reinforced the domain. At the same time he merged the red and green orbs within his mind, his eyes started to turn yellow. Power started to erupt from within his body, ready to explode at any given second. Thump. Another muffled thump. This time it was closer than ever. Lazarus remained firm, his eyes locked towards the distance as his domain started to tear, the hands of the statues tearing through the black fabric that made it. It was also through such tears that Lazarus was finally able to see the source of all the noise outside, and his body tensed. It was another statue. One much bigger than the rest. With its eyes void and features worn out from time, it moved mindlessly in his direction before extending its hand, massive enough to engulf his entire domain, reaching forward, trying to grab him and his domain. Lazarus braced himself, his entire body tense as the domain around him lowered and the statues that clung onto it fell down. He slowly tensed his back, his entire body popping and squirming beneath the water as his eyes turned completely yellow. Then, swoosh! He thrust forward, his fist directed towards the approaching hand. His fist soon connected with the statue. Everything paused. But not for long as the surrounding water rippled. Bang! A terrifying explosion quaked within the water as the statue's hand recoiled back as the massive frame of the statue staggered. Lazarus, on the other hand, remained standing on the spot, partially because of the hands that emerged from beneath him holding him in place. At the same time, he hastily looked in Anaz's direction. Surely he's done. His expression changed when he saw that he wasn't where he was before, but he soon felt relieved when he saw that he wasn't too far off, his face pale. Their eyes met and Anaz Riley smiled. I couldn't help it. So his gaze seemed to say before he shook his head and raised his hand, displaying a large chunk of the coral. Lazarus cocked his head, confused by the sight. But soon he watched as Anaz brought the coral to his neck. The next scene took him by surprise as the coral quickly latched onto Anaz's neck, wrapping around it like a collar and pulsing into life. A dim glow materialized from the coral around his neck, and seconds after, his right hand started to turn gray. No, Stone. What is he? Lazarus didn't move towards Anaz. Although he was confused by his actions, he understood that he must have had a reason for them. And sure enough, not long after the coral latched onto Anaz's neck, the statues around him stopped looking at him. So that's the case. The statues were controlled by the coral, and by wearing one, he'd be able to mix with the statues. Lazarus understood everything in an instant, but as soon as he did, his head flicked up towards the distance where he saw the enormous statue heading in his direction again. Thump! Thump! The water shook as it rushed in his direction, its lifeless eyes locked towards him. Lazarus quickly looked around him before flicking his hand, several threads shooting out to pick up one of the corals coming from the statue and bringing it towards him. The gigantic statue continued forward, its fist driving down towards him, the very water getting sucked into a vacuum as its fist moved towards him. Swoosh! Catching the coral, Lazarus brought it to its neck as he felt a sharp pain piece his neck shortly after. The world came to a sudden standstill as everything stopped. Keeping his breath in check, Lazarus slowly turned his head to see the fist just a few inches from his face. He broke into a cold sweat when he saw the fist before turning to look at Anaz. He was okay, but looking at his hand, Lazarus grew worried. He already noticed the subtle graying of it. Don't tell me. He reached for the coral on his neck and tried to pull it, but found himself unable to pull it. He exerted more strength, but it refused to budge at all. Lazarus's expression turned grim at the realization, but before he could think of a way to solve the problem, he saw Anaz walk up to him and point up. Up? Lazarus frowned, but then he saw Anaz point at the coral on his neck and then up again. That was when it hit him. Is he saying that as long as we can go up on the water surface, the coral will fall off automatically? But how did he know this? Lazarus wanted to ask, but stopped himself. Judging from the rate of certification, I assume it'll take about 30 minutes for me to turn into a complete stone. That's more time than the amount of breath I have left. In that case, I'll use this time to figure out the entire situation. His gaze slowly turned towards a certain direction. His eyes flickered. Using mana sense, he could still more or less make out where the two figures were. They weren't too far from here. However, just as he was about to take a single step forward, he felt a sudden throb in his head, halting him on the spot. What the? Throb? His head throbbed again, and he pressed his hand against the coral latched onto his neck. Lazarus clenched his teeth as he realized what was happening. The true mind of the corals. It's trying to take control of my mind. A mind-type monster? His lips slowly curved upwards. What luck? Chapter 629, Temple of the Dying Light 4. Throb. Lazarus felt his head throb. He could feel something trying to seep deeply into his mind, trying its best to control it. At first, his expression was grave, but gradually he relaxed. A mind-type monster. Had it been any other type of monster, he'd be worried. But a mind-type? That's the last thing I fear. His gaze slowly turned towards a certain direction. It was the same direction where the two lords had gone, and his eyes narrowed. He felt the main source of the control coming from there. It was hidden deep somewhere, silently controlling everything that the corals latched onto. It was sort of like a hive mind. In other words, it had one singular mind while acting in multiple bodies and entities. Throb. Lazarus's face tightened. The throbbing grew more powerful, his head feeling as though it was being smashed. Lazarus also started to understand the meaning behind Anaz's indications. It's just like he suggested. If we do go out of the water, the corals will stop having an effect. But it wasn't because the corals couldn't survive above the water. No, it was because the hive monster could only operate within a certain range. The further from the mind, the weaker the effect. The only issue would be getting out of its range. In spite of the statues not attacking them, Lazarus could still keenly feel that the mind was paying close attention to their actions and movements. If either one of them tried to defy its control and tried to run, it would activate the statues once again, making sure they wouldn't be able to get far. This was how most of its victims fell. Not only that, but it was also slowly petrifying their bodies. That made running away even harder. Lazarus lowered his head to stare at his hand, which was starting to stiffen. It wasn't just his hand, he could feel his joints also experience something similar. The moment I can't move my body is the moment that I die. This was, without a doubt, a troublesome monster. However, he wasn't totally helpless. Gradually closing his eyes, he sank into the darkness of his mind. He stood like that until he felt something within his mind and his head throbbed again. He latched onto the pain, focusing directly on it. And then, he reached out for it. His mind blanked shortly after. By the time his mind recovered, he found himself in an entirely different place. Where's this? I looked around me. The world felt dark, but within the darkness, I could feel thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of different red dots. They were sprawled all around me, like some sort of stars, all of which seemed to be connected to something. No, more importantly, I looked down at my hands and massaged my face. Something was interfering with my mind. I couldn't focus, so much that I felt my persona suddenly fade away from my mind. At this very moment, I was me again. I tried to become Lazarus again, but the moment I tried, a certain throb pierced my mind, preventing me from doing so. That's annoying. The more I immersed myself in the character known as Lazarus, the more I felt I was closer to reaching something. I could feel the very foundations of my emotive magic starting to shake, and I knew that it wouldn't be long before I reached the key to finally upgrading my emotive magic to the 5th level. I was extremely close. I just had to immerse myself deeper into the character. This sudden immersion-breaking situation wasn't very ideal for me. The best course of action is to try to figure out how the reason for why I suddenly snapped out of my immersion and get back to it as soon as possible. Thankfully, it wasn't as though I didn't have an idea. I had a very clear idea as to why the situation had occurred as I looked around me. Towards the numerous red dots around and the faint red lines that connected towards the very distance where a deep red orb appeared. I could see a line connecting from my neck towards the massive ball of red in the distance. The hive mind. The more I looked at the ball, the more I was convinced of this. And soon, a certain voice echoed next to me. You're correct, human. I turned my head to see Pebble standing next to me. However, I was surprised to see Pebble in a different form than I was used to. Pebble was much bigger, its form about 5 times the size of me, as its entire body radiated with pressure as its thick gray scales shimmered under the multiple red lights in the distance. What's wrong? As if sensing my sudden shift, Pebble looked at me. I could only force a smile while shaking my head. Nothing. It's nothing. I couldn't exactly tell Pebble that I felt just slightly intimidated by its real presence. For the love of Heraclius, I couldn't. Pebble's ego would simply inflate too much. Hee hee. Chuckling, Pebble looked around, its muse raising. There's only me now. With that stupid all gone, I'm the only one you can rely on in these situations. See? Its ego was already too inflated. Yes, you're right. I shifted my attention towards the distant ball of red and squinted my eyes. I needed to figure out a way to handle that thing in the distance. But how exactly could I do that? I needed to figure out the solution quickly, considering that I was still underwater and that I couldn't hold my breath for long. Furthermore, there was also a, you are a very strange human. Breaking me out of my thoughts was a gentle whisper filtering through my mind as I felt my body tingle. I hastily looked around, my eyes narrowing as I eventually settled my gaze on Pebble, who looked at me in confusion. What's wrong? No, nothing. The voice was different than Pebble's. It was softer, less overbearing, a lot quieter. Were you not looking for me? I am, right before you. The red orb in the distance pulsed and throbbed, the world shimmering in red as my head flicked in its direction. Wait. You're a strange human. Your mind is a lot stronger than anyone I've ever encountered before. And not only that, but you've somehow managed to tame a dragon. Tamed? Who's tamed? Pebble furiously looked in the direction of the orb, its eyes glaring at it. But it wasn't like the orb was wrong. What do you see in the human, dragon? Completely disregarding Pebble's words, the orb pulsed again, its light slowly fading to display a weird-looking brain. The sight made my chest grow heavier. Why would someone from a race so prideful follow a human? What do you see in him? The hive monster's voice continued to whisper across the surroundings, the multitude of red dots shimmering with each question it asked. I could only stand in silence, calmly listening to the brain's words. While I already knew this in advance, this monster appears to be at around the Terror to Destroyer rank. Only creatures of such a level had enough conscience to speak. Of course, not all Terror ranks were capable of developing a consciousness. However, quite a few did, and this monster present was capable of communicating. This made things a little bit more complicated. Mainly because the smarter a creature was, the harder it was to beat. I would have much rather have fought against a physically stronger creature than a weaker one with intelligence. Is it possible that the human is holding you hostage and forcing you to work for it? That could be possible, but I don't sense any restrictions in you. Who is forcing whom? Pebble glared at the mind in the distance. I'm here willingly. The human is merely helping me find a new body. Once I do, I'll be free. So he's helping you? Yes. But how can you trust a human? The creature appeared to be asking strangely specific questions. What was it trying to achieve? I've been with the human long enough to know. And I'm also not the only one who did. There was another stupid guy before. That owl, it used to be a spirit too, but now it's back into its own body after reaching the destroyer rank that the human helped it achieve. Oh! The human helped it achieve such a thing. I could now feel the keen interest from the creature as the red dots around shimmered with curiosity, almost as if thousands upon thousands of eyes were looking at me at once. It made my body shiver. Yes, the human did it. I was able to witness everything. Really, now. I suddenly started to have a bad feeling as I hastily turned my head in Pebble's direction, but by the time I did, it was already too late as the red dots around me shone with a brilliant red light and thousands upon thousands of red lines connected with Pebble. It all happened so fast that by the time I reacted, it was already over as Pebble's entire body froze on the spot. Shit! I cursed while moving towards Pebble. However, right as I moved, the dots connecting to Pebble faded as though nothing had happened. I see. How interesting. The dragon doesn't seem to be lying. Eh? I slowly turned my head to look at the mind as I felt it pulse slightly, almost as though it was smiling at me. To be able to do something like that and earn the trust of two wild creatures like that, perhaps it might be possible to ask you. Ask me? Ask me for what? Help, of course. I stopped, blinking my eyes. You want my help? Yes, I would like your help. My thoughts paused there. This request caught me off guard. I had originally been prepared to do whatever it took to fight the monster and gain control of it, but things took a completely different direction than I had originally expected. But at the same time, this was a welcome change. I had originally been worried about how to deal with the two lords. Although I was strong, I was nowhere near strong enough to deal with them. Things, however, were different if I had the help of this weird mind-like monster. If I somehow worked with it, then tell me exactly what you need help with. If it's something that I can do, I'll try my best to help. Chapter 630, Temple of the Dying Light, 5. Are you sure you want to help me, human? You have yet to hear what I need your help for. Obviously, if it's something ridiculous, I will refuse. It all depends on what sort of situation you're trying to pull me in. Then what? What will you do after you reject me? That will depend on what your actions are going to be. The world turned silent a moment after. All I could do was stand still while waiting for the monster to answer. I didn't exactly mince my words. I couldn't trust the monster. I understood that the only reason it had even thought about talking to me was because of Pebble's sudden appearance. I was confident it wouldn't have spoken a single word to me had it not been for Pebble. For a dragon of all things to be following a human and willingly become a spirit. It certainly aroused its interest. In some way, Pebble was the reason that this was possible. But even so, I wasn't just going to mindlessly accept the terms of a monster. I needed to benefit from this exchange. If I were simply going to be exploited and potentially backstabbed later, then I'd have no choice but to fight the monster. Had it been any other type of monster, I would have been worried. But this was a mind-type monster, and my specialty was the mind. I wasn't scared of fighting it. My only issue was my breath. I only had about 10 minutes left. All right. Eventually, the monster spoke. I'll make sure to compensate you accordingly. The task should also be within your abilities. I smiled upon hearing the monster's words. I liked the sound of that. This was all that I needed to hear. So long as the task was manageable and I received appropriate compensation as a result, I was completely fine with helping the monster. So, what can I do to help you? Let me hear you out first before deciding. Yes. The monster paused for a brief moment, supposedly summarizing the situation in its mind before speaking, its quiet, whisper-like voice somber. The great primordial one is being stirred. Oh! Didn't that sound familiar? Stirring such a creature will only lead to the utter devastation of the ecosystem. Not only the surface one, but the deep one too. I, alone, am not capable of resisting the Great One's wrath. So you need my help preventing the Great One from being stirred? That is correct. So that means you're aware of what is going on? And who is the one responsible for all of this? That is correct. And you've done nothing about it? I've tried, but I was incapable of defeating them. They are numerous and very strong. I frowned at this part. If it really tried and failed, what made it think that I could help it? This situation felt a lot more complicated than originally anticipated. But it wasn't like I could reject helping it. This situation, it directly lined up with my own interest. I too wanted to stop whatever was causing the red tide and stirring the Great One. It was in my best interest to do so. I understand your concerns, human. But you mustn't worry. The only reason why I am incapable of defeating the humans is that I lack a good host. One that perfectly suits my needs. I suddenly started to have an extremely bad feeling about the situation. It couldn't be that it wanted to use me as a host. That's when you showed up and I was able to see just how powerful your mind was. If you were to become my host, then I would have less trouble defeating the ones responsible for all of this. Do not worry, human. You will have full autonomy over your body if you become my host. In fact, it should be I that should be worried. Why exactly? Because in order for you to become my host, I must reveal my true body. I suddenly started to understand. If it was really as I thought, then the one in the advantageous position was me. If the mind had to expose its real body in order to use me as a host, if it tried something, I could always have either Pebble or Anaz do something to it and kill it on the spot. There was, of course, a lot of danger involved in this situation since the mind could very well foresee everything in advance and somehow stop Pebble and Inaz from attacking its main body. The risks were all too clear. As if capable of reading my mind, the mind asked, "Are you worried that I might try to take over your body without your consent?" In truth, yes. I didn't bother hiding my thoughts and just nodded my head in agreement. I was indeed worried about it potentially taking over my body. How could I not be worried? This monster had been trying to kill me just moments prior. In that case, you don't have to worry too much. Your mind is simply too powerful for me to completely take over. Even if I wanted to, I'm afraid it is impossible for me to do so. The only one that truly bears a risk in this operation is me. And you'd expect me to believe your words like that? It's not about believing or not. I know that you yourself are already aware of just how powerful your mind is. The monster was sharper than expected. Indeed, I was already aware of the fact that my mind was stronger. This was also the reason why I was confident in battling it through the mind space. But just because my mind was stronger, it didn't mean that I could trust it. What if it had some sort of trump card? We do not have much time, human. What will your decision be? I paused, thinking about all the pros and cons of the situation. In the end, there was only one answer. The obvious one. I saw no reason to reject the offer. At the end of the day, not only would I gain an appropriate reward, but the monster's interests were aligned with mine. Using its powers to help me defeat opponents that were beyond what I was currently capable of handling, I was also making my life a lot easier. The only downside was the potential risk involving the situation, but there was a greater risk in operating without the monster's aid. As such, I didn't hesitate any longer. I'll agree to help you. You've made the right decision, human. The distant orb fluctuated wildly, the red dots around it similarly pulsing as the world started to pulse in a powerful red hue. I looked around me before eventually closing my eyes and feeling something latch onto the back of my head. What's going on? What happened? Why is he like that? Enes looked at the merchant with a worried expression. Ever since he had put on the coral, he had suddenly stopped moving and closed his eyes. It was as if he had suddenly become a statue. If not for the fact that he could still sense a heartbeat, Enes would have thought he had died. But why was he like this? Enes looked around him, his gaze falling on the statues that eyed the two of them. His chest tightened as he felt the statues' gazes. He knew that they were being watched. What should I do? At this rate, things will get bad for both of us. Despite his panic, Enes was able to remain outwardly calm as he tried to figure out the situation. He first looked at the merchant's body to see if there were any abnormalities. However, looking at him, there didn't seem to be anything wrong. Then, why was he suddenly frozen like that? Could he be allergic to the corals, or could it be? A thought struck Enes's mind as his eyes started to widen. Could it be that the monster was trying to take control of the merchant's body? If it's true, then things might be even worse than I originally expected. Enes started to chew on his lips, keeping his breath in check. He could last for about an hour with his breath held. This came as a result of his specialization in the body path. His training granted him an exceptionally strong body and lungs. But that was besides the point. His body grew alert as his eyes sharpened. Looking around, he moved nearer to Lazarus while his body tensed. So far, he could still feel Lazarus's weird gravity skill pulling him down. He had yet to lose the battle. I'll protect him in the meantime. This was so that he could ensure he wouldn't be interrupted by some random monster. If he was interrupted, then who knew what was going to happen? But then again, if that was what the monster wanted, it'd have used the statues already. Could it be that it wants to retain the body in perfect shape or... Feeling something stir, Enaz's head flicked directly towards Lazarus as something sprouted from beneath the seabed, stabbing right at the back of his neck. Shit. Enaz grew alarmed, but he wasn't able to react in time as whatever it was that shot towards him latched onto his neck. Enaz felt his entire body tense. And then, Lazarus slowly opened his eyes, his gaze calm and expression colder than usual. For a moment, he felt completely different from the merchant he had grown familiar with. But that wasn't for long as the all-too-familiar smile marred his features and he slid his finger across the water. The next scene left Enes completely shaken as he watched the statues around them stir, all moving at the same time and walking towards them. Oh shit! The muscles on Enaz's body squeezed and tensed as he clenched his fists tightly, ready to fight. However, just before he could even get started, the merchant raised his hand. And statues stopped. Eh? Enes blinked slowly, trying his best to process the situation. Then, slowly turning his head towards the merchant, he saw him smiling directly at him. That was when he saw his mouth move. Pretty cool, right? Chapter 631, Hollowed 1. Lazarus dragged his finger across the water, the statues around him starting to move with his movement, forming a single line on each side of him. Enes stared at the scene with a baffled expression. He looked at a complete loss. Lazarus merely gave him a cursory glance before smiling. He was rather satisfied at this very moment. This sort of power is not bad. His mind felt extremely clear, and looking around, he could see red threads connected to each of the statues before him. That wasn't all, he could also notice the threads stretch beyond the area he was in and towards different areas. As if everything was connected to his mind, he could perceive everything. With just a single thought, he could see what his other connections were seeing, and at this very moment, it was as if the entire city was under his eyes. This sort of power. It's incredible. But at the same time it was also extremely draining to his mind. Just connecting to one point made his head throb. The back of his head also hurt. There's not much time to waste, human. I can feel something sinister starting to build not far from here. If we don't hurry now, I'm afraid we might be too late. All right. Lazarus snapped out of his drunken state and quickly sobered up. Closing his eyes, several thousand red dots appeared in his mind. He expanded them individually, displaying different areas of the city. Eventually, his gaze settled on a tall and imposing structure. Constructed from dark stone and rising from the very heart of the city, the structure was encased in a crimson coral which clung to it from all sides as if trying to pierce its surface. The result was a haunting, almost sinister appearance. That coral. It belongs to none other than the hive monster. I presume that's the structure I need to go to? That's correct. Okay. Lazarus didn't waste time and expanded even more visions. He saw through the entire structure of the city. That was also when he noticed several abnormalities in certain areas. I can detect several powerful monsters lurking here. I should probably take this path. An ideal path appeared in Lazarus's mind shortly after. By taking into account the monsters that were secretly lurking around and looking at the fastest route that he could take without alerting them, he soon opened his eyes again and took a step forward. At the same time, he nudged Inaz with his head, who followed him after a brief moment of hesitation. Lazarus could feel from his gaze that he was doubting something, but he paid Inaz no mind. He couldn't be bothered to explain since he couldn't talk. Thankfully, the journey to the large pyramid-like structure was fairly easy. In just a matter of minutes, they managed to arrive before the structure as Lazarus saw for the first time just how big the structure was. The structure was extremely imposing, and when he turned his head, he could see the reverence in Inaz's gaze as he looked at the place. That was when something clicked in Lazarus's mind. Could this place be related to the goddess of light? He had only ever seen Inaz make such expressions whenever he dealt with something that was related to that goddess. Lazarus's curiosity deepened as he gazed at the structure, his eyes inevitably drawn to the large opening that led inside. There was something unsettling about it. The way the darkness within seemed to consume every trace of light, as if the entrance itself were alive and waiting, made it especially unsettling. This is the point where you must exert caution. I had tried multiple times to enter this place, but without any success. The only thing I could do was try to break the entire structure, but even that is not good enough. I can see. Lazarus looked at all the numerous corals that were attached to the pyramid. If that didn't make it clear, then he didn't know what would. He proceeded forward shortly after, allowing for the darkness to swallow him. Inaz followed him shortly after. Of course, Lazarus also brought several statues with him. He was sure they'd be handy further down the line. Inaz didn't look very averse to entering the structure. And it soon became very clear why, as the corals in their necks pulsed with a faint red light, illuminating the surroundings as a large tunnel appeared in their vision. A couple of steps into the place, large murals and engravings appeared on the side of the walls. The most eye-catching mural was that of a young woman in white and long yellow hair standing before a large crowd of people, their hands stretched in her direction as they revered her. She looked holy, pure in the mural. And as Lazarus turned his head, he could see Inaz staring at the picture with a similar expression. Something about this doesn't feel right. Lazarus was well aware of these gods. He knew that they weren't really gods. They were merely people who had been granted powers that no normal human should have ever come into contact with. The thing that made him curious, however, was the reason why they chose to allow people to revere them as gods. At first, Lazarus assumed it was because of their deeds, but it now appeared to be deeper than that. The gods. They were trying to get the people to revere them. But why? Why would they try to do that? Would he be able to find a reason within this strange structure? And was the series of events perhaps connected with that? Lazarus's eyes sharpened as he moved forward, the pulse around him growing dimmer and dimmer. At the same time, he activated Lament of Lies and masked his presence alongside that of Inaz. The deeper he went into the corridor, the colder the water became, and as his steps started to slow down, he noticed a faint opening in the distance. Lazarus didn't move in immediately. He instead controlled one of the statues behind him and urged them forward, his mind connecting to the coral attached to the statue, granting him a vision of what was happening. The statue gradually moved towards the opening. In order not to attract much attention, Lazarus made sure to dim the light coming from the coral attached to the statue, and eventually, moving past the opening, a large empty hall appeared. The world was silent as the surroundings appeared dark, with the faint outlines of a large statue in the distance and several long rows of benches lined up to face the statue that most likely depicted the goddess of light. This must be where they used to pray. Lazarus more or less had an idea of what this area represented. Looking at how empty it was, his mind started to relax, but then, someone is watching. The monster's voice echoed in his mind and his entire body tensed as he flicked the head of the statue to look around. Watching? Who was? And then he saw it. Gradually, their heads turned to display hollow and empty eyes, and Lazarus felt his heart skip a beat. He lost connection right after that. It all happened so fast that he hardly had any time to react. By the time he realized what had happened, a sharp pain invaded his mind as his face changed subtly. He held onto the pain before calming down. What happened? The same thing that happened to me every time I tried to enter the place. It appears as though they have some sort of way to completely sever my connection with my bodies. I got that, but who are they? Who exactly is doing this? Humans. Humans. Lazarus thought back to what he had witnessed just a moment prior and shook his head. That's not possible. The things that he saw, they looked anything but human. They were humans who are now dead but have taken over the bodies of humans. Eh? What the hell was that supposed to mean? Lazarus was at a complete loss. Your companion over here should have a good idea. You can try asking him. Lazarus slowly turned his attention towards Inaz, who was looking at the murals around with a certain glint in his eyes. Thinking about the monster's words, a thought crossed Lazarus's mind and his face twitched. Why didn't he think about it before? The coral attached to Inaz's body pulsed faintly and Lazarus spoke. I need your help. Ha! Inaz's head flicked around, completely caught off guard by Lazarus's words before finally settling his gaze towards him. Wait, you can speak? Yes. But that's not important right now. I need your help in figuring something out. Lazarus closed his eyes and followed the thread that connected to Inaz's coral before pressing his finger forward, right into his forehead. Wow! Inaz's eyes opened slightly at the unexpected action, but soon enough, a memory floated in his mind and his expression quickly changed. Lazarus watched as Inaz's face slowly turned completely pale as he took a step back. A certain fear latched onto his face when he stared in the direction of where the situation had occurred. We have to leave? He said, his voice strained. Lazarus frowned upon hearing Inaz's words. Why? I understand what is going on. We have to leave immediately. Lazarus's frown deepened, staring at Inaz with a pensive expression. He could see from the clear fear in his eyes that he knew what was going on the side. Tell me exactly why you're acting like this. Inaz looked towards the opening, his step moving back. Those things. They are not things that we should get involved with. They are hollows. Hollows? Lazarus's brow raised. He had a vague understanding of what a hollowed was. They were the bodies that had been taken over by the voices. And if those were truly hollowed then? This is bad. His gaze turned away from the opening in the distance, but just as he did, his movement stopped as he felt something from above him. He froze, slowly turning his head to look up. A pair of white eyes met his gaze. Chapter 632, Hollowed 2. A pair of white eyes glowed within the darkness. As the coral embedded in their necks pulsed with a faint red glow, the white eyes came into focus, part of a twisted silhouette hanging just above. A person, their body contorted and mangled, was fused to the ceiling of the corridor, limbs bent at different and unnatural angles. Crap! Inaz was the first one to move as he hastily moved back, pushing his back towards the entrance of the temple. His figure was fast as he moved, covering several meters at once. Wait, there's no need to panic just yet. Lazarus's voice brought Inaz out of his panic. It was only then that he stopped and realized that the body was not moving. Hey! Come and take a closer look. Lazarus pointed at the body above. The body isn't one of those hollowed. No, maybe it is, but it looks like it had fought someone beforehand and the result was it getting smashed towards the top of the tunnel. Oh, you're right. Inaz felt a little embarrassed once he saw that this was indeed the case. He had been so on edge when discovering the hollowed that he had instantly panicked when he saw the pair of white eyes. As his mind sobered up, he began to closely analyze the situation and soon a thought crossed his mind. Do you think this was done by the two captains? Yes, it's most likely them. Lazarus replied calmly. Taking a look at how one-sided the fight appeared to be, this was the only reasonable assumption he could make. Only they would be able to do something like this, and taking a look to see how fresh the wounds were, he could tell that the fight had happened not too long ago. The only thing that made him confused was the hollowed at the opening not far from where the two were. Did the two captains not fight those? His brows furrowed as he began to think about the situation. But right as he did, the entire building rumbled. Rumble. Rumble. What's going on? Inaz and Lazarus both looked around, their expressions changing as they felt the rumbling coming from deep within the temple. That was soon followed by a series of terrifying presences as the ground beneath them started to crack. The situation quickly became obvious to them. A fight is happening below. Did the two captains figure out the ones responsible for this? As Inaz questioned, Lazarus didn't answer but kept his gaze directed down. He flicked his hand and made several statues charge ahead as the hall from before came into his view. From the familiar hall, he caught sight of several hollowed slipping into a chamber beyond the statue of the goddess. They were going away? Let's go. He shared the vision with Inaz and charged ahead, following the hollowed from behind. Rumble. The rumbling persisted, growing more pronounced as the very foundations of the pyramids started to shake. If this persisted like this, then it wouldn't be long before the entire pyramid crumbled. They didn't have much time. Lazarus sped up his movement while Inaz followed from behind. The two slipped past the statue and entered the chamber where a long flight of stairs came into view, descending into the depths below. Lazarus flicked his hand and the remaining statues he had brought moved down, providing an extra eye for the two of them. Rumble. The deeper they descended, the more intense the rumbling grew, echoing through the stone around them. The rumbling added to the silence around them as they moved with caution, letting the statues survey their path ahead. There. Spotting something, Inaz's expression changed subtly. Lazarus noticed it too, his steps slowing as his eyes narrowed. Ahead, the faint amber light marked the outline of an opening. From within, an overwhelming pressure emanated, multiple powerful presences stirring in the dark. The two exchanged a glance, tension crackling between them. Should we go in? Maybe you might be able to do something, but at my current strength, I might just become a burden. That's fine. Lazarus's eyes narrowed as he looked at the opening. He also thought about just leaving and letting the two lords handle the situation. Furthermore, he could also tell that the current commotion was sure to attract the attention of those from within the temple. But at the same time, he also understood that there was a very good chance that this was a trap. The clue was obvious. Suddenly and out of nowhere, one of the victims from the mysterious flyers comes to them and jumps down into the water? Sure, there was a chance that it was indeed some sick coincidence. However, Lazarus didn't think so. He also felt that the same was true for the two captains. Whatever was causing this was trying to lure them deep within the temple to do something. At this point, they had no other option but to enter the opening and see what the situation was. Waving his hand, Lazarus activated Lament of Lies. Their figures blended with their surroundings and the two began to move ahead. Another reason why he had to move forward was because of the hive monster. Lazarus was a lot more confident in handling any situation with it attached to his body. The more he engaged with the power it offered, the more boundless the possibilities seemed. He even felt his control over emotive magic starting to improve. He started to understand things that he didn't understand before. This was what he had been searching for the entire time. He wanted to bask in the feeling for longer. Rumble. As the surroundings shook again, Lazarus and Inez moved towards the light, their steps as light as possible. As they stepped through the ember glow, a vast cavern stretched open before them. At its far end loomed a towering altar, suspended above a void of inky black light. Lazarus's gaze was drawn to it, compelled, almost as if the altar itself were reaching out, trying to lure him in. His hand reached forward, almost as if he was trying to grasp it. But then, snap out of it. The hive monster's voice snapped him out of it as cold sweat trickled down the side of his face. Lazarus then hastily looked at Inez but was shocked to see him doing fine. Eh? Why? Lazarus tried to ask, but his eyes once again were drawn towards the altar. That was when he spotted the several dozen figures that flanked the altar. The figures all donned black hoodies, hiding their figures, but what they couldn't hide was the skinny frame of their pale hands as black veins lingered on the surface of the skin. Not far from it, the two spotted the captains, locked in a fierce fight with several dozen such figures. Bang! Bang! The surroundings shook and the water rippled. Their clash was fierce, threatening to make everything collapse at any given second. This is bad. Inez came to the same observation that Lazarus had. With just one look, they could see the two captains were in a disadvantageous situation. This alone felt shocking when taking into consideration their status as overlords of the seas. For them to be pushed this far. It really did seem like they were up against extremely powerful opponents. Lazarus's eyes narrowed as he looked around. He was trying to see if there was some sort of leader, but as he looked, he didn't spot anyone who particularly stood out. His eyes narrowed further. Could the leader already be fighting the two lords, or is he not here? The thought made his heart palpitate. He couldn't imagine just how powerful the leader would be if he existed. What now? Inez asked, his eyes sweeping across the vast chamber. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped as he caught the shift in Lazarus's expression. A faint smile tugged at his lips, his gaze fixed on the captains locked in battle above. What else? His body slowly floated, turning in their direction. He scratched the back of his neck at the same time as he slowly closed his eyes and deepened his connection with the hive monster. Then, with a single step forward, he faded from the spot, leaving Inez at a complete loss. Shit! Bang! And let out a quiet groan as a powerful blow struck her hand, the impact sending her skidding across the surface of the water. How in the fuck are these things so strong? And groaned as several silhouettes appeared around her, attacking her in different directions. Her eyes grew sharp as their movements traced across the water, and she just barely managed to avoid the attacks. Shit! Avoiding wasn't the problem for her. The problem was the fact that they wouldn't stop coming at her. When one attack failed, they'd attack again, almost as though they had infinite stamina. This made her mind hurt as her skill relied heavily on her mind. Swoosh! Swiftly lowering her head to avoid another attack, she hastily looked back to see Silas also struggling to deal with the hollowed. Bang! Still, he fared a little better than her, thanks to his resilient build and surprising agility. Despite his broad frame, he moved through the water with startling speed. Most likely, he was the fastest amongst the 7 lords. But even he had a hard time against the hollowed. Bang bang! Damn it! How are these things so fucking strong? What in the world is going on? Hearing Silas's scream and looked around, her gaze settling onto the large altar at the center of the cave. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she more or less had her own guesses. Whoever is responsible for this entire thing isn't stirring the primordial one just for the sake of worshipping it. No, their goal is to destroy the entire city. Her first thoughts were on the other lands. They'd be the first ones she'd assume would want Virathanash to be destroyed. However, she also quickly realized this wasn't possible. There was something else at play. Something that she couldn't understand, and just as she was avoiding another attack, her pupils dilated as she heard a scream from beside her. Ark? What? Her eyes widened in horror when she spotted a hand pierce right through Silas, his body stopping mid-motion. Blood seeped into the water as the world around her seemed to freeze. She couldn't make out the current situation. Silas? Dead? No. How? This makes no sense? He was strong. Really strong. How could he be defeated like this? It made absolutely no sense. Then, all eyes gradually turned on her as Silas's body fell onto the seabed. Thud. Her body grew weak at the sight. She might just be fucked. Chapter 633, Hollowed 3. Bang. The water rippled, something heavy crushing against Anne, who managed to block the attack. Unfortunately for her, just as she managed to deflect one attack, another came from above. Then below. Then above again. They struck from all directions, relentless and somewhat disorienting, but her emerald eyes glowed even brighter, piercing the darkness, catching every ripple in the water. With each shimmer, she saw the next strike before it came. This was a special ability of hers that she had managed to acquire after killing a certain beast within the Crimson Sea. It was a terror-ranked creature, and the main reason she was able to reign over the Crimson Sea for the past decade. Without the skill, she wouldn't have been able to make it to where she was. Swoosh! The water rippled again, and the attacks came again. Damn it! Damn it! And just barely managed to dodge the attacks again, her eyes falling towards the fallen captain beneath the water. Seeing the gaping hole on his chest and the fresh blood that was flowing out of it, she felt her heart sink. She still couldn't wrap her head around his death. How could someone as strong as him die like this? It made absolutely no sense to her. Unfortunately, she didn't have much time to process the shock. Ugh! With several hands emerging all around her, Anne's eyes flickered again as she traced the path of their attacks and dodged their attacks. Her movements were nimble. She was avoiding everything. But that was until she felt her back hit something. When did I? Her heart sank when she saw the wall of the cave right behind her. Turning her head back to the hollowed, her face sank when she saw them surround her from all sides. Ah, this is bad. The situation had gone beyond what she had originally expected. Surrounded on all sides, she was put in an extremely disadvantageous situation. Her eyes flickered and her teeth clenched. Looking around and seeing the figures slowly starting to approach her, the mana inside of her body boiled. The situation was bad, but she wasn't in despair. She had been through much worse, and she had yet to reveal her trump cards. Not yet. And quietly waited for the hollowed to move closer to her. Her eyes flickered beneath the water, locking onto the nearest hollowed. But just as she prepared to attack, something unexpected happened. Swoosh! Appearing from out of nowhere, a strange red light pulsed. Then, one of the figures froze on the spot as a red light pulsed around their neck. Everything stopped at once as all heads flicked in the direction of the figure that had just materialized. It's you. Anne's eyes widened the moment she caught sight of Lazarus. She recognized him in an instant. Not because of how he looked, but because of the mana that he gave off. He was the same guy from before. He's alive? And her heart froze when she saw him standing behind the hollowed with a flat expression. His expression was calm as his gaze eventually fell on her. But the shock that gripped and only deepened as the hollowed figure before him slowly turned, its attention shifting toward the others. Then, swoosh! Something shot through the air, hurtling in their direction. What? Anne's eyes widened as another hollowed was suddenly hurled through the water. Bang! The water rippled in its wake, then stilled. In the spot where the hollowed had landed, another now stood. This one had a piece of coral embedded in its neck, pulsing a faint red hue. Anne's gaze slowly turned towards the man who stared at the hollowed with narrowed eyes, his left eye twitching just subtly. Lazarus was currently trying his best to withstand the pain in his mind. He was having a really hard time. Resist. With your mental power and mind combined, we should be able to control all of them. The pain is not real. No, it was very much real. There was no denying the pain that he was currently experiencing. Lazarus's hand shook as he directed his gaze towards the other hollowed and then back towards Anne. He pointed his finger at her and then the other hollowed. His message was clear. Stop them so that I can control them. What? Anne looked at Lazarus with a baffled look. She could feel his strength straight away. He was around tier 6. She was struggling to understand how someone like him could control the hollowed like that. Something about the situation was off. However, understanding her current situation, she knew that she couldn't afford to waste time thinking. She had to act fast. Help him or not? The choice was obvious to her. Her emerald eyes flickered, locking onto the nearest hollowed. With a sharp flick of her hand, a long black whip coiled into existence. Without hesitation, she thrust it forward. It was almost as though the whip faded from her hand. The moment she slashed with it, the whip faded from view before appearing right before the hollowed. It was so fast that the hollowed was unable to react in time. Gotcha! The water rippled and the hollowed hurled in Lazarus's direction as he stared at the incoming hollowed with a calm expression. He extended his hand and flung a piece of coral toward the hollowed. It struck immediately, latching onto the back of its neck as a faint red light pulsed in the water. The hollowed squirmed and Lazarus's expression paled. Focus on enduring the pain. I'll control the puppets to protect you. The hive monster spoke in his mind as his head started to feel like it was being split apart. A couple of connections appeared in his mind at the same time, connecting the two hollowed with his mind. Although he could sense control over the two hollowed, each attempt felt like a sledgehammer crashing into his skull. It was really painful, and the more it hurt, the less he felt like he could focus on himself. No, I must resist. I can't fall apart here. Lazarus clenched his teeth and shut his eyes. At that moment, the hive monster linked to him seized control of the two nearby hollowed, forcing them to shield him from the incoming barrage launched by the others. There were 1, 2, 3, 4 hollowed in total that were trying to get to him, but as if in perfect sync, the hive monster managed to block all the incoming attacks. Lazarus used this chance to close his eyes, allowing for the darkness to take over his mind. He had to maintain focus. He couldn't allow the pain to bring him out of his current state. Until I reach the 5th level, I have to maintain focus. He had to immerse himself further into the character. He had to stop thinking of this as an act. He had to become the character. Lazarus, Lazarus, Lazarus. The wandering merchant from afar. He needed more layers. An emotive mage with curse magic. No. That was too much like Julian. He had to be different. He had to. Lazarus gradually opened his eyes and looked around. While the pain in his head still existed, it wasn't as bad as before. He could tell that the hive monster was sharing some of the burden with him. He didn't know how many more hollowed he could control, but he decided to try his best to control as many as he possibly could. But for now, tapping his finger, a sword appeared in his hand. It was one of the many swords he had at his disposal. The sword wasn't anything great, just a simple relic. But it was enough. As he slowly raised it and looked around him, lines appeared in his vision, tracing all sorts of paths. Lazarus finally understood what he had been missing the entire time. It was the sword. In order to fully adapt to the character, he had to change the way he fought. Bang! The water around him rippled as one of the hollowed he controlled hurled back next to him, its body riddled with all sorts of injuries. It was even missing one hand. Right as the first hollowed fell back, the other followed. Swoosh! Lazarus watched everything calmly as his gaze settled over the remaining hollowed. There were now 3 of them. He could tell that their strength had reached the 7th tier, almost at the 8th tier. They didn't waste a single second as they shot towards him. Lazarus didn't flinch as they moved. Instead, he tossed a couple of swords to the hollowed around him as the golden paths in front of him expanded. Go! With a casual look, he flicked his hand and the hollowed under his control moved. Swoosh, swoosh. The 2 hollowed mirrored the exact movements playing out in Lazarus's mind, their bodies now moving with a grace and fluidity that hadn't been there before. Lazarus's mind split even more as he controlled them, but he didn't bother with the pain. He focused his mind entirely on the paths in front of him, tracing them in his mind with the swords in the hollowed hands. The 2 moved in unison, effortlessly dodging incoming strikes while launching attacks of their own. Swoosh, swoosh. The situation turned around rather quickly. In just a few moments, they started to push the hollowed back. That was in spite of all the injuries in their bodies. Anna, who had been watching the entire time, couldn't help but open her mouth in shock as she looked at Lazarus. This? Was she seeing things? What sort of freak was this guy? She had a hard time hiding her shock as she started to shudder. It all suddenly made sense. The reason why he had been so bold to appear and how he had managed to survive back when she had ignored him. He was a monster. And pressed her lips tightly as she focused on her own hollowed. However, just as she did, the situation suddenly changed. Before either of them could react, a figure appeared behind Lazarus. A large hand clamped around his neck in an instant, squeezing it tightly under its grasp. By the time he managed to catch a glimpse of who it was, Anne's voice rang out across the water. Silas. Chapter 634, Locked, 1. And stared in Silas's direction with wide eyes. Holding on to Lazarus with one hand as he struggled under his grasp, his hands flying as he tried to reach for him, but to no avail. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. He was supposed to be dead. She saw it with her own eyes. The gaping hole in his chest and his breath leaving his body. And had heard, long ago, of rare items and forbidden substances said to grant revival from death itself. One of the most famous was Mortem's blood. The direct blood of the god of immortality. Is it possible? No, there's no way. If he did have something like that, he'd already be gone by now. The collectors weren't things that they could afford to provoke. It had to be something else. Something. Ah! Anne's expression changed drastically as Silas's eyes started to change. Gradually, they started to turn a familiar white color, and her heart sank as Lazarus appeared to struggle even further under his grip. She wanted to move but couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on Silas. Finally, she started to understand the situation and her heart sank deep into her stomach. A hollowed. Silas. He was a hollowed. Ah. Ah. A weird sound came out of Silas's mouth as his head started to contort and twist. It twitched a couple of times before settling back to normal, his gaze slowly lowering to meet hers. Anne. Anne. His voice was like a quiet whisper. One that appeared to be mixed with 20 other voices. Male and female, young and old, soft and guttural, dozens of voices layered into one. The unnatural harmony sent a shiver down Anne's spine, raising every hair on her body. Lazarus continued to struggle beneath Silas's grip, which only tightened with each passing second. His face was pale, and his struggles only grew with time. He was starting to get desperate. Anne wanted to help, but she couldn't. She couldn't afford to help as her entire body tensed as she looked at Silas. She was trying to make sense of the situation. When? Since when was he one? From the start? Or did he get taken over by them at one point? Hollowed weren't rare to see. They did tend to appear from time to time. People who had their minds taken over by the voices of the past. There were times when she had seen several hollowed in the past. But never in her life did she meet one this strong. This was an extremely big crisis. Especially since hollowed fed on people in order to become stronger. They fed on people and turned them into voices. This was why most hollowed were hunted down when found. They were like parasites. Extremely dangerous. And the fact that Silas was one and yet no one had noticed the entire time made things even creepier. This situation was a lot more complicated than anticipated. What are you thinking so much about? There's no need for you to think much. Just quietly accept the situation and come to me. What are you thinking so much about? There's no need for you to think much. Just quietly accept the situation and come to me. Silas's voice whispered once again, pulling her attention towards him. I have been waiting for so long for this moment. I had been planning for so long and I expected to take longer, but then he showed up. I have been waiting for so long for this moment. I had been planning for so long and I expected to take longer, but then he showed up. Silas lowered his head to stare at Lazarus, his lips slowly pulling as his white eyes flickered. He was the last ingredient I had been missing for so long, and the moment we found him, we knew that I couldn't wait any longer. We pushed everything forward and lured the two of you here. Only with the two of you present can we finally ascend. He was the last ingredient I had been missing for so long. Anne's face paled upon hearing Silas's words. This was planned all along? To advance. Wait, advance. Her entire body froze upon hearing those words. If he were to advance, just how strong would he become? I can't let this happen. This might be extremely bad. If he were to be allowed to advance, he would become an extremely terrifying existence within the mirror dimension. Only a few would be able to stop him, but as a continuously growing creature, it wouldn't be long before it rose to a point where only the primordial ones or the gods could do something about it. Anne's eyes sharpened as she looked around. She needed to find a way out of this place. He did say that I'm an ingredient. In that case, so long as he doesn't get me, I'll be able to delay his plan for a bit. I'll relay everything to the temple. They might get the goddess to interfere directly. Though she thought this, she didn't actually have much faith in her plan. It looked like Silas had planned this situation extremely well, and she also didn't have much faith in the goddess doing anything. She, alongside the remaining gods, was extremely indifferent to the world. They had also not shown up in hundreds of years. And clenched her teeth, her eyes darting around even more frantically. How do I? That was when it happened. In the midst of her thoughts, and just as Silas was about to open his mouth, a change occurred in Lazarus's direction. He suddenly stopped struggling. Almost as though he had never struggled to begin with. Then, his body began to change slowly. His hair faded to a lifeless gray and his cheeks hollowed, sinking into his skull. The change came abruptly, startling both Anne and Silas as they looked in Lazarus's direction. But the most striking change wasn't even his appearance change. No, it was his eyes. They slowly started to turn white. White? Anne paused, and that was when she noticed it. The figure standing right behind Silas, his hand outstretched and placed onto the back of his neck. Lazarus floated calmly in the water as he squeezed Silas's head. Fear, he mumbled in his mind as he channeled his emotive magic. He poured everything into his hands. He wanted to completely incapacitate Silas. He was confident his emotive magic was strong enough to do that. But, Hikek. The expected reaction never occurred. Instead, he was greeted by a mocking laugh as Silas slowly turned his head and his white eyes stared directly at him. As expected. I didn't choose wrong. You were the right person all along. As expected. I didn't choose wrong. You were the right person all along. Lazarus's expression remained stoic as he met Silas's gaze. He was calm in spite of the situation as he slowly pulled his hand away and nodded. Right, he must be after my emotive magic. He had more or less guessed this during their first meeting, especially when he touched his hand. Lazarus recalled feeling something strange as he placed an emotive tag on him. Or at least tried to. Very clearly, the tag didn't set into his body. At first, Lazarus was confused, but now it all made sense. Silas. Or more like, the hollowed. They had no emotions. They were just an empty canvas of lingering memories. The situation became clearer to him the moment he met the first hollowed and he started to put the pieces together. My previous guess about this being a trap wasn't wrong. Silas purposely lured me into this place in order to use me as an ingredient to advance further. The timing of which everything started also coincides with everything I've found out. Lazarus's eyes remained calm as he scanned Silas. There was not an ounce of fear in his face despite his emotive magic not working. Why was that? Anne thought as she looked at him. Was this some sort of facade of his? But looking at him, it felt deeper than that. She didn't have to wait long for an answer. The moment Lazarus lifted his hand from Silas's head, Silas struck, his arm slicing through the water, aiming straight for Lazarus, who stood perfectly still. Anne's face changed when she saw Silas's hand grasping Lazarus's neck. He didn't even attempt to run away as Silas's lips pulled into a sinister smile. We got you. We got you. But his smile didn't last for long as Lazarus's body faded, replaced by one of the hollowed from before. Appearing right below, Lazarus calmly looked at Silas. You won't be able to catch me. One of the skills granted to him by the hive mind was the ability to swap places with anything that had a coral attached to them. The ability consumed a lot of mana and mental power. Therefore, he could only use it a couple of times. But that was more than enough for him to simply run away. Lazarus locked eyes with Silas, their gazes holding for a long, heavy moment. But then a slow, sinister smile crept across Silas's lips as he shifted his focus toward the altar below. Lazarus's brows furrowed tightly at the sight. He started to have a bad feeling about the situation. But contrary to his expectations, Silas raised both hands, seemingly in a gesture of surrender. "Very well done. Very well done." His voice whispered in the water. "You managed to trick us. Very good job. You managed to trick us. Very good job." Silas nodded his head slowly before turning his attention towards Anne. His eyes locked with hers for a brief moment until he smiled. And then, swoosh, he disappeared from the spot. The sudden turn of events completely caught the two off guard as they stared blankly in the direction of where Silas had previously been standing. Did he just run away? This was the first thought that ran through their mind. A subtle tremor pulsed beneath them, barely perceptible, like a breath from something old and ancient. But they felt it. Both heads snapped toward the altar in the distance, where a sickly green light had begun to seep through the cracks. Then the surface split. CRA crack. Slowly, unnaturally, the smooth stone of the altar peeled open, not like machinery but like flesh parting unwillingly. A wet, glistening eye emerged from the darkness within. It was massive and horrifying. The moment its pupil surfaced, the world stopped. Time itself fractured. The water froze in place, bubbles caught mid-rise, hair suspended like threads of glass. Sound died. Motion died. Even thoughts grew sluggish. Only the eye moved. And it was staring directly at them. Both stared back, their bodies frozen in place as they recognized the eye. That eye. It belonged to none other than Exerul, the great primordial one. Chapter 635, Locked 2. The eye stood above the altar. It was large, the pupil curled into a thin slit. The moment it opened, it was as though the surroundings had frozen in place. The world refused to move. Lazarus and Ananaz could only stand completely still, their entire bodies frozen in place as cold sweat trickled down their back. What was this? The eyes of the three trembled, their thoughts starting to fade. The vertical slit of its pupil stretched endlessly, a void deeper than the abyss itself, and from it radiated a sinister red glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. It wasn't just looking at them. It was peering through them. Every instinct screamed to flee, but their bodies were paralyzed. Trapped in that crimson gaze, as if even the notion of resistance had been stripped from their bones. The eye knew them. Every secret. Every fear. Every thought they'd ever tried to bury. It knew it all. And the idea itself felt suffocating. A deep sense of helplessness washed over them. It was a sense of helplessness that stemmed from their insignificance in front of the creature before them. They were like specks of dust before it. And then, as all hope seemed lost, the eye closed. It began to fade shortly after, the altar cracking beneath before shattering completely. Bang! Tom started to move once again as the three of them stood frozen in place, minds and eyes blank. There were no thoughts in their minds as they stood still in the water. This persisted for an unknown period of time until their eyes started to regain some clarity. Where did Silas go? Did he run away? He shouldn't have gone far. Anne's voice was the first to break the silence around them as she hastily looked around, her emerald eyes piercing through her surroundings. She had to find him at all costs. She couldn't allow someone like him to roam the land. He was a walking calamity. And tried to feel her surroundings, but regardless of how hard she tried, she couldn't feel his presence at all. He was gone. He was nowhere near them anymore. Shit. And cursed before turning her attention towards Anaz and Lazarus. The two were standing blankly, their expressions a little dazed. She found their actions to be a little weird. There's no way Silas's disappearance affected them this much, right? It'd be odd if it did. Thankfully, Inez recovered rather quickly as he looked around, his face pale. He was also looking for Silas, afraid he'd show up out of nowhere and attack them. And yet, that never happened. He was gone, and even as they waited, he never showed up. Eventually, his gaze fell on Anne and his body stiffened. He looked at her, completely at a loss, his eyes squirming before settling on Lazarus, who was slowly coming out of his daze. No, not quite. He wasn't quite Lazarus. As Julian's eyes flickered, he looked around, his eyes starting to regain their usual focus. What just happened? I felt lost. Looking around me, I was at a complete loss. Why did I lose concentration? Why am I? The more I looked around, the more confused I became. In one moment, I was dealing with Silas, and in the next moment, he disappeared. That was also the moment I snapped out of my persona. But why did I snap out of it? What could have caused my focus to fade like that? I tried to recall anything that could have caused such a situation, but I couldn't. Nothing. I couldn't think of anything, and that was what made me extremely apprehensive. I was extremely confused and lost. This situation made no sense to me at all. All right, it doesn't matter. I'll just try to go back to it. I tried to return to Lazarus, but the moment I did, a sharp pain shot through me, snapping me out of my focus. Holding onto the side of my face, my lips trembled. My mind. It was completely drained. I could hardly focus enough to use any of my major skills. And whenever I did try, the pain would return. What the hell is going on? I tried to get in contact with the hive mind, but I was even more surprised to see it unresponsive. I hastily touched the back of my neck to see if it was still there, and much to my surprise, it wasn't. What? How's this possible? Wasn't it attached to me? When did it leave? The more the situation unfolded, the creepier and more eerie it became as my heart pressed against my chest. I lowered my head and looked down. That was when I spotted a small red coral, different from the rest, with a large beak protruding from its center. Was this its real form? I didn't hesitate to move down and grab it. It's still alive, but it's not responding. The situation felt incredibly eerie. For whatever reason, my mind was completely drained, and the hive mind, a destroyer-ranked creature, had detached itself from my body, almost as though it had been harmed by someone or something powerful. My frown deepened further as I looked at the small coral in my mind. If I wanted to, I could probably kill it with a squeeze of my hand. I could gain its bone and sell it for a lot of money. It was extremely vulnerable. But since it didn't do me any harm, I won't do it any harm either. I also had a lot of money available for myself. I didn't need to do this. It was better to turn the hive mind into my ally than to kill it. I also wanted to know if it had any idea of what was going on. I'll wait until it recovers before asking. With those thoughts, I tucked the coral away and looked up to find an Anna staring at me. I gave them a brief glance before lowering the gravity around me and moving up the water, and pulled her gaze from me as I moved up, her emerald eyes glowing as she looked around once again. She's most likely looking for Silas. I was also curious to know where he was. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford to waste any more time here. Originally, I should have been able to stay here for a little longer. I had about 15 minutes left. However, things were different now. For some reason, I had less than a few minutes left of air inside my lungs. The situation was quite bad, actually. I had to get back up as soon as possible. Thankfully, and soon gave up her search for Silas and shook her head. I walked past her, heading back the way we came. I need to hurry up. I had to get back up as soon as possible. I heightened the gravity around me and started to sprint out of the temple. I thought I was fast, but compared to Anne, I was extremely slow. She zoomed past me, shooting up towards the upper floors. Staring at her back, I flicked my hand and shot a thread in her direction. The simple action pierced my mind as I flinched. How does this hurt more than step of suppression? Sensing the thread and slowed down and turned to look at me. A frown marred her features as she looked at me. She didn't seem to be very pleased with my actions. I couldn't care less as I pointed at my nose and then up. Her brows rose up. Then, as if understanding the situation, she moved towards me and extended her hand. I reached for it and looked back to see Anne is not far away, also reaching with his hand. Grabbing the two of us, Anne's body shot away. The moment she started moving, my face twisted as the water smacked against it. It wasn't until I used my mana to shield myself that I was able to stop it. Slowly, I turned my head and saw Anne as watching me. His expression was blank. Almost unreadable as both his eyes were open into large O's. Then, PFTTT. He started laughing. Keck. That didn't last very long, though, as his simple action made him lose the little air he had in his lungs. Yuck. I started laughing too. But, oh shit. KH. I also lost air and started struggling beneath the water as I covered my mouth with my hand. And as was no better. His face had turned completely pale, slowly turning purple. I figured I must have looked the same. I was trying my very best not to show any reaction at this moment. Though I wasn't Lazarus, I needed to keep the persona clear. This bastard, he is sabotaging me. Splash. Thankfully, we soon reached the surface of the water and I took deep and heavy breaths as I started to float on the surface of the red water. Ha! Ha! HAA! And as emerged right next to me, similarly struggling for breath. My head felt light, my body completely drained. As I drifted across the crimson sea, I stared blankly at the white sun above and let out a long, weary breath. I fucking hate the water. This experience had solidified this thought for me. I used to not mind the beach, but after this, I wasn't even sure I'd be able to go to one ever again. Have you two recovered enough? Bringing me out of my thoughts was a certain voice, and when I turned my head, I saw Anne standing above the water, her clothes completely dry and arms crossed. There are quite a few questions that I want to ask the two of you. She smiled. I hope you won't mind that. I closed my eyes. I really did hate the sea. Chapter 636, Locked 3. Who are you? The questioning began as I found myself aboard a large ship, its wooden cabin dimly lit by a single lamp, just enough to make out and standing before me. She didn't waste a single moment after getting out of the water, dragging Inaz and me into her ship. Neither of us could put up a fight, and in the end, we were both dragged in. Just my luck. You especially. And nudged her head at me, her brows furrowing. I've never seen you before. What? I looked at her weirdly. And why would you have seen me before? Are you saying that you know the faces of everyone within Virathanash? That'd be ridiculous. No. The captain shook her head before pointing at her eye, which shone a faint green emerald hue. But I can tell if I've ever met someone before. I raised my brow but understood. She probably isn't lying. I had seen enough from her and those weird eyes of hers to know that she was most likely not lying. I grew curious while staring at her eyes. Was this a byproduct of a bone? Since I'm not familiar with you, I take it that you're not from around here. Where exactly are you from? The captain continued to press me. I just stared back at her while leaning against the wooden chair I sat on. It was rather uncomfortable. It also didn't look like I was detained as I had no restraints on me, but it felt like I was. I couldn't leave even if I wanted to. If I weren't detained, I didn't know what I was. And Az was also in a similar situation, even though she appeared to be somewhat familiar with him. Or at least, she seemed to recognize him. He was probably here because of me. I'm just a traveling merchant from afar. I've been here for quite some time now. I've also opened up a recent shop. The Grey Cham. Yes, I know. Then. It doesn't change the fact that you are suspicious. And how exactly does that help you in any way? I'm pretty sure you have more serious matters to tend to. Like, you know, a certain captain who magically disappeared from out of nowhere the moment that it was revealed he was a hollowed? Yeah, I'm not buying that. He was certainly planning something. He wouldn't just let us go after revealing that we were important ingredients for his plan. Something was at work beneath the surface, and it all traced back to the moment he vanished. In that instant, my mind drained and the hive creature slipped from my neck, collapsing to the ground. Something happened in that moment. I felt that was the key to understanding the situation and what Silas was planning. The captain's eyes flickered as she looked at me. Her thoughts were unknown to me, and each passing second felt like it dragged on forever. But that all ended a second after as she sighed. Yes, you're right. She sat down on her chair. Although I'm still suspicious about your origins, I've seen enough to think that you're not on his side. At least, for now. Her eyes narrowed, and I felt a cold chill running down the back of my neck. I could only force myself to remain calm while looking at her. But at the same time, a thought occurred to me. I originally planned on trying to get Silas to bring me to the Eclipsed Maw. However, now that she's here, there's nothing that says I shouldn't use her. She was one of the 7 lords and was most likely not a hollowed. About that part. At this point, anyone could be a hollowed. Her lips pursed as she tapped her arm. The situation is rather troublesome. I've already reported the matter to those of the temple. The best course of action is to wait for them to give us a reply before deciding on the next steps to take. Next steps? What was she talking about? She rolled her eyes. Are you stupid? Do you think that Silas is just going to leave like that? He very obviously has got us locked or targeted. He must have formed some sort of plan and is actively trying to hunt us. I don't understand the reason why he suddenly left, but I'm sure it must be part of his plan. I'll need the 2 of you to remain with me in the meantime. What? It was Inez who shouted. He looked at and with wide eyes. What do you mean remain with you in the meantime? No. I can't remain here. He stood up while biting his nails, walking around his chair, occasionally glancing in the captain's direction and mumbling things like, I can't leave my post for too long. If I do, all my work will go to waste. I need to be promoted. I can't fail like this. Ah, there he was again. Him and his obsession with the temple. Looking at him and seeing his expression, I grew even more curious. His obsession, it felt somewhat weird. What exactly did this goddess do to make him this loyal and obsessed with them? I previously checked and there were no signs of emotive magic or spirit magic on him. He seemed to genuinely worship her. What the fuck? As I heard the captain's words and I turned my head to meet her gaze, I explained. He's from the temple. Oh, you're not supposed to say that. And as quickly turned to me, but it was already too late. He could only awkwardly look at the captain, who made quite an expression. Well then, I guess I don't need force to keep you here, do I? And as looked at me in despair. I could also see hints of hatred in there, but I just nodded my head. That's for nearly killing me back there. He gave up shortly after. That's about it from me. The captain began moving towards the door of the room. She nudged the 2 of us with her head. Follow me, I'll bring you guys out to get you familiar with the ship. You'll stay here until I manage to get this situation sorted. Clank. The wooden door opened and the strong scent of iron and salt entered the room. Lazarus glanced in Inaz's direction before following her from behind. Inaz could only follow along shortly after. He was still mumbling a few things, but he also realized that he had no real say in the situation. Even the temple had to be respectful to one of the 7 lords. What did he think he could do? I shook my head and stepped out of the room. A long wooden corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit by scattered lamps. It extended for several meters before ending at a staircase that led upward. The 3 of us walked in silence as we passed by several crewmates. Greetings, Captain. Captain. From the way they were greeting her, it was clear that they highly respected her. I looked around, taking in the sight before moving up the stairs as the scent of iron and salt became more pronounced and the all-too-familiar gray sky appeared. Long white sails billowed from a massive mast, each one stretching at least 30 meters. Above them, a green flag fluttered in the wind. Make sure the anchor is ready. Time to swab the decks. Check for dry rot. Caulk the seams. The ship's main deck was littered with crewmates as they roamed around, shouting and barking orders as the place felt extremely lively. I stared at the scene before me with interest. This was the first time I had ever seen pirates in action, and it was quite an interesting sight. Even their accents were quite interesting to hear. This right here is the main deck. It's where the main mast stands tall, right in the center. And if you look to the sides. She gestured toward the heavy cannons lined along the ship's edge. You'll see these beauties. One shot from them could blast the likes of you 2 into splinters. Costs a fortune though, so I'd rather not waste a single round unless I have to. She laughed as she said those words. I didn't think she was joking. Staring at the cannons and seeing the numerous runes placed on them, I could tell that it wasn't anything simple. There's no particular rule that you need to follow while being on the ship. The captain began to lead the two of us throughout the ship, explaining its layout in detail. I didn't really understand why she was doing this, but I soaked in the information in my mind. In case something did happen, it was best to know everything about the ship. I was rather unlucky. The main rules of the ship would just be to listen to my orders. Whatever I say goes, and that's pretty much it. Oh yeah, don't kill and do shit that you wouldn't do in the city. Just common sense type stuff. Oh, I could do that. This wasn't really hard to follow. The captain began to rumble more about the ship. About how she had managed to acquire it, what she went through, and all of that stuff. I listened attentively while staring at the crimson sea that stretched towards the white sun that hung in the distance. Something about the reflection of the white sun on the red waters felt enchanting. Lazarus couldn't pull his gaze away from it. Beautiful, isn't it? I only snapped out of it when I heard the captain's voice whisper from my right as she stood with her arms crossed, her gaze locked onto the horizon. When did she move next to me? This sight is one of the reasons I do what I do. Her curly hair fluttered as she looked into the distance. Dangerous as it is, the crimson sea. It's also breathtaking. But this isn't even close to its finest sights. I've sailed through places so deadly they make your blood chill, and yet each one was more beautiful than the last. The Isle of Broken Oaths, the Scalding Reefs, the Lantern Path, the Eclipsed Maw. I've seen them all. Her emerald eyes sparkled as she spoke, and I. Lazarus slowly pulled his attention towards the distant horizon, too. Neither said a word as they stared at the crimson sea. Indeed, it was quite beautiful,